Right, well, thank you very much, Peter. Good evening, everybody. As Peter says, my name is Rupert Lowe. I'm a local. I farm up the road between Withington and Compton Abdale, and I'm involved in various small businesses, entrepreneurial businesses. I've been in the City of London, and I think I've done quite a number of things and a lot of travelling in my life. And I thought what might be helpful is if I sort of explain to you why I find myself standing here talking about why I think we should vote to leave the European Union. In the past, I've not only stood for the referendum party in the Cotswold constituency where I kept my deposit, I've also done a lot of lobbying against the Maastricht Treaty. I also supported Business for Britain, and I funded a group called Reform, which challenged a lot of Tony Blair's ideas when he was in power. And I've done my bit, I think, hopefully, to obviously spread the word to the British people about the fact this is their last chance, in my opinion, to take back their democratic sovereignty. So, how did I come to be standing here? Well, it all started because I'm a member of a club in London called Boodles, which you may or may not have heard of, which is in St James's. And when I was younger, I'm now 58 years old, it was quite a long time ago, I was actually chairman of the Boodles Young Members Dinner, and I had speaking for me a man called William Rees-Mogg, whose son is Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is, I'm pleased to say, also a sound man on the subject of Europe. And his father spoke beautifully, and the following year I was invited to sit on the top table, and I won't say his name because he's dead now, but there was a very eminent member of Maggie Thatcher's cabinet who was on the table. And we got into a discussion about Europe, and I asked him quite a lot of questions about it, and ultimately what he said to me was that the reason we agreed to sign up for the European Union was that we believed it would avoid further war in Europe. That was his reason. So I said to him, well sir, 3 of my father's family were killed in the trenches in the First World War. My mother lost one of her uncles in Dunkirk. Do you think the British people would have supported a surrender of British sovereignty if you'd actually told them what the plan was? And this was the post-war plan of the European elite, which involved Monnet, Spinoza, our own parliament, all the post-war leaders. And he said no, they wouldn't. So I said to him, so on that basis, you thought Nanny knew best, did you? So he said, well, we'd been through 2 world wars, we'd had lots of suffering, lots of death, and at the end of the day we felt that was the right thing to do. So I said to him, well, so I asked him again, if you'd put it to the people, do you think they would have supported you? He said no. So I think the first thing about the European Union, which we all need to know and understand, is it's founded on deceit. It is not founded on a sound basis. It's founded, if people had asked the people, and the people had said yes, fine, but they didn't ask the people. And if you look, as I did after this, which is why I became so adamant about the Maastricht Treaty and the surrender of our sovereignty, and you actually then looked at what the hands were doing and not what the mouth was saying, you saw this gradual creep of the surrender of the nation state, and if you like, to the credit of the superstate. And that was the post-war plan. And that is ultimately what we are now dealing with. So, and if you look, ultimately, as I say, it's, in my view, they're as guilty of mis-selling as the banks were of mis-selling PPI. It's as bad as that. So, if you look, first of all, the Treaty of Rome, probably one of the biggest surrenders of our sovereignty came with the European Communities Act in 1972, which people like Enoch Powell adamantly against. And indeed, it's the European Communities Act, if we do vote to leave on the 23rd of June, which will need to be repealed, and we will keep the bits of it we want, and we will repeal those bits that we don't want. So ultimately, that is a key act. But again, it was a huge surrender of sovereignty. We then have the Single European Act, massive surrender of sovereignty. The Maastricht Treaty, which again, when I asked most of the politicians, I wrote to all the media, I wrote to all the politicians, i.e. members of the House of Lords, members of the House of Commons, Euro MPs, the media, I wrote to everybody asking if they'd actually read the Maastricht Treaties. I don't know anybody here ever read it, but it was complete rubbish. It had more loose ends than a plate full of spaghetti. Ultimately, it was just, again, a further surrender of our sovereignty. It tied people up in meaningless words. And would you, I mean, again, good men like Norman Lamont admitted he didn't even bother to read it. Well, I don't think a lot of our MPs did, yet they signed it. And ultimately, then March 1997, and my wife who's here this evening got so bored of hearing me bang on about the fact that John Major, Paddy Ashdown and Tony Blair, all three people in 97, all three parties were wedded on surrendering our currency to the euro. And if you go back and you look, that was in everybody's manifesto. Thankfully, Jimmy Goldsmith put up £50 million and he put up candidates wherever there was a need to put them up. And he stood on the platform, and this is what I did in 97. I kept my deposit in the Cotswolds, which I was very proud of, and we actually told people what was happening. So that was back in 1997, and we forced all parties to promise a referendum before they finally surrendered our sovereignty to Europe, i.e. they surrendered our currency, which ultimately would have been an absolute disaster. We'd all be finished. Yeah. But so when we hear our great leaders talking about how we have to vote to remain and it's the right thing, and they come up with all these spurious figures about, you know, how it's going to affect our mortgages and X, Y, and Z, and all the scare tactics that are being used. It's nonsense. We had it all. If you remember when we shadowed the Deutschmark in the ERM, and we had what was called Black Wednesday, I think it was called, turned out to be White Wednesday, because actually our economy boomed despite all the worry that people had. Equally, I think most people here tonight, if you ask them, would you rather be on the pound sterling or would you rather be in the euro? I think most people almost unanimously say we'd rather have the pound. Yeah. And the reason it's so important to keep the pound is ultimately the pound is like a spring that protects us against trade. So if a trade balance gets too far against us, our currency falls, our goods look cheaper, and there's a natural balance. So in free trade with floating currencies, it's not a bad thing for currencies to weaken, and in fact it wouldn't be that terrible if sterling weakened. If you look post-war, sterling has basically been on a constant downtrend, and we're still here and we're still trading, and we still have the fifth largest economy in the world. So we're hearing all the same lame arguments as we heard, and ultimately that's the reason I'm standing here. I passionately believe that the British people now have a serious chance not to damage Europe. We don't want to damage Europe, we're part of Europe. We don't want to run away from Europe, we're not going to do that. But we do want to take back our own sovereignty. And if questioned by the headmaster, would you rather be governed by your own parliament, sovereign parliament of Westminster, where you can actually remove a government and individual MPs if you don't like what they're doing? Or would you rather be governed by an amalgam of 28 different states? And if I tell you that over the course of Cameron's parliament, on 72 occasions, we have tried to amend bills and acts that have been going through the European Parliament, we have 8% of the vote, and on no occasion have we actually influenced those bills. So we don't have control over our own destiny. So this is actually our last chance, and that's why I'm standing here. And I thought what I'd do is very quickly read a piece which I saw the other day, which nobody's actually mentioned this before, and I thought it was very good, so forgive me. I'm going to just read you this piece. And it basically involves 1805, and you may be interested to know that Napoleon said the following: "There must be a superior power which dominates all other powers, with enough authority to force them to live in harmony with one another, and France is the best place for that purpose. We must have a European legal system, a European appeal court, a common currency, the same weights and measures, and the same laws. I must make all of the peoples of Europe one people, and of Paris the capital of the world. Fast forward to today and exchange Paris and France for Brussels and Berlin. The principal obstacle to Napoleon's aspirations was us, Britain. He therefore decided to try and ruin us economically by closing the whole continent to trade with us. As there was widespread commercial jealousy of Britain at the time, this was a popular policy in France. Napoleon set ever higher tariffs before eventually banning all British trade from the continent. In theory, the French policy was bound to bring about economic hardship in Britain. Again, fast forward to today and substitute Brussels for France, and this is what Brussels is threatening to do by suggesting that we would not be able to secure a favourable trade deal, or any trade deal at all with Europe if we vote to leave. Our own Prime Minister, keen as he is on Europe, is using similar threats to scare us into supporting his aspiration for a single state of Europe, which, despite his largely worthless negotiated concessions, are pretty similar aspirations to those as articulated by Napoleon. Again, in theory, he and the Remain camp would have us believe that we would suffer economic hardship if we vote to leave. France and Napoleon might have carried the day if British trade really had begun to suffer. But in the long run, France probably suffered more than Britain. Napoleon's continental system, as he called it, trade restrictions against Britain, was in effect unenforceable. Smuggling and corruption hold it even in the French ports, whilst many of the European states and allies hardly bothered to enforce it at all, or found ways to get around the embargo. Fast forward to today again, and does anyone seriously suggest that the majority of countries in Europe will pay any attention to Brussels any more than they did to Napoleon, and cease to want to trade and export to the fifth largest economy in the world, and one which imports substantially more from Europe than it exports to Europe? Are we likely to see the disappearance of the likes of the new Mercedes, the VWs, and from British roads anytime soon? I don't think so. Peoples trade with each other because they want to and because they enjoy an economic interest or benefit from doing so, and not because an unelected cabal in Brussels tell them to do so, and more particularly how to do it. That cabal remorselessly and profligately creeps into control of everyday lives and businesses through the issuance of more and more rules, all in pursuit of their own vision of Europe. It's a theoretical vision with no sense of the practical realities. It's the antithesis of what a free market is or should be. It opens borders to trade and negates that openness by tying down those who wish to trade with more and more red tape. Its only true open borders are its external borders and its inability to control them, resulting in disastrous levels of migration and the consequent laying waste to the unique cultural heritage, values and history of the individual countries within Europe, which is what makes Europe what it is. The theory of economic hardship prophesied for us by Cameron is as invalid today as proved to be the case in the time of Napoleon. Napoleon marched into countries as far afield as Portugal in the west, to Eastern Europe and Russia in the east, Italy in the south and Scandinavia to the north, to impose his vision for Europe by force. Brussels does the same, but so far up to the border of Russia, seeking to enforce not by military force but by diktat. Napoleon's vision ultimately collapsed in upon him through military exhaustion and his inability to force his will upon the people of Europe. The European Union, originally envisaged as a group of nations trading freely within a common market, will similarly cease to exist and will collapse because the Brussels bureaucracy has no democratic mandate to support its dictatorial enforcement of its vision on a populace which increasingly is hostile both to its dictatorial manner and their vision for Europe. The only country that benefits from Europe is Germany, which exerts increasing economic control over Europe. The key to German success is because it shares a common and weak currency, the euro, whose value would collapse without it, enabling its exports to be sold far more cheaply than had it retained the Deutschmark, and other European countries retained their currencies, which would have weakened against the Deutschmark, as I say, acting as a shock absorber. Germany has grown staggeringly rich and is getting richer by the minute at the expense of its European partners who are unable to compete with the efficient colossus which is Germany. As more and more European countries of differing abilities but sharing a common currency with Germany become increasingly sick, countries such as the UK will find themselves being forced to join the communal efforts to save our ailing partners until we too become sickly and can only meet our forced contributions by borrowing more as a nation, which we can increasingly ill afford to do. Outside of Germany, and the unelected bureaucracy within Brussels, the citizens of Europe will, like their countries, become increasingly sickly and impoverished as they suffer the higher levels of personal taxation which will need to be levied upon them if their governments are to be able to meet their obligations to and demands from Brussels. The vision of Europe that Brussels is pursuing is doomed to fail. According to those familiar with Angela Merkel's thinking, even she believes Britain leaving the EU would be an ultimate disaster for Europe. It need not be for the UK if we have the courage to recognise that we are better off out of it, at least until the EU is forced to truly reform. The Cameron renegotiation deal is largely worthless, and even worse, probably legally unenforceable. It will do nothing to protect the UK from greater integration, or EU migration, or migration from outside the EU through the failure of the EU to protect its external borders. Those non-EU immigrants, in any event, once naturalised in countries such as Germany, will be able to exercise their right to enter the UK legally, regardless of the wishes of the UK people. The vision of Europe that Brussels and Merkel is pursuing is doomed to fail. They try to speak with a common voice, in reality their own, for a Europe where there is no commonality of purpose. The vision is already hull below the waterline as it is sinking under the weight of its proponents' own grandiose plans and deaf ears. There is no reason for the UK to remain on the sinking ship and participate in what Merkel describes as the disaster of Europe. Better instead to man the lifeboats and leave now while we have time. Our leaving and the loss to Europe of the fifth largest economy in the world and the second largest in Europe is about the only thing that is likely to make the EU recognise the true disaster that it has become. Europe will suffer more from our leaving, both in trade and self-confidence, or rather perhaps better described as arrogance, than will the UK from leaving. It will be then and only then that the UK will be able to negotiate a deal where we set the terms of our relationship with Europe, one of worth and one which is legally enforceable. So I say to you tonight, basically, back your faith in Britain, back our history, back our respect for the rule of law, for democracy, cultural heritage, respect and appreciation of others, and our business skills and our entrepreneurship, which are ultimately going to be damaged by a massive colossus of a superstate that will crush the individual and credit the superstate. Thank you very much. Vote pro the EU, which is ultimately the biggest protector of the supranational company that exists. I mean, how can you get that message across to them? Will they ever get it? Well, I'm personally not anti-immigration. I think targeted immigration is very good for the economy. But mass immigration uncontrolled, and again, I come back to one of my favourite subjects, is I blame Cameron for what's happened in Libya. Yeah, what's happened in, him and Hollande were there sort of almost, gleefully talking about the Arab Spring, and we created this vast problem, which spans Libya, Syria. Nobody in the media is talking about it. It's quite disgraceful, really. But I think you raise a very, very good point.
But this young man on radio and TV.
He should be. And I think it's incumbent.
You don't sort it out.
I think it's incumbent on everybody in this room to do their bit, not just him. If we want to win this, people have got to take some personal responsibility and do it.
The young man could actually almost draw the analogy as well, that the EU is becoming a bit like a cult.
Yeah.
You can go in, but you can't get out. And if you get out, you're punished.
Absolutely, he's raised a great point.